Christ is in our midst. Glory to Jesus Christ. I wanted to make a short impromptu video about, I just got the thought of doing maybe small videos, just whatever comes to my mind. It might be interesting to some people, I don't know. Or at the very least, I could record it for myself and then I'll remember what my thoughts were at a particular time, I guess. Anyway, so I wanted to discuss scholasticism in general and my attitude towards it, and also I guess maybe a little bit about relationship of Byzantine Catholics and Byzantines in general and scholasticism, and also I guess I'll touch a bit about the ressourcement or whatever it's called in English, like going back to the sources, Nouvelle Theologie and those type of things. That claim to go back to the sources, whether they're successful or not. So I guess thanks to the work of some authors, I think it's more. I think it's becoming more common knowledge now that the relationship between scholasticism and the patristics is not as black and white as it was assumed. So the typical story is that scholasticism is a kind of false way of doing theology, that it's too rationalistic, it gives too much leeway to the mind, to the rational thought, instead of, and then whatever is they consider to be the patristic thought. So like mystical, or I don't know what would they how they would describe it, but anyway, that patristics is good, scholasticism bad. And I think, as I said, works of some people like Father Kapis, I think it's bridging the gap a bit for the Orthodox. I mean, the Orthodox realize that it's not as easy or clear-cut as they like to think. So, first, I guess I'll say in general about... the original name of the video was supposed to be... why I don't like scholasticism. It was supposed to be like tongue-in-cheek kind of thing. I was going to mention the schools of scholasticism, right, and stuff like that. But first, I should say that I'm not in favor of any particular school. So I don't like to be called Thomist or Scotist or whatever, right? But I don't like to be also grouped with ressourcement and going back to the sources, and also more so even to these some Orthodox authors who are trying to combine the insights of Byzantine theology with contemporary continental philosophy. So there are works that try to kind of combine Maximus the Confessor with phenomenology, with like Heidegger, or like with existentialists, the French guys like Sartre, and maybe even Derrida in some cases, which I think is kind of interesting. So I'm not one of those guys who says like, postmodern stuff or existentialist stuff, it's all horrible and let's not read it. I mean, it might very well be all horrible, and I actually quite close to that conclusion myself, but there is still interesting insights in it, I guess, and sometimes you get interesting insights when you combine stuff like that, so I'm always willing to like read and hear about it, but I think a lot of it is not that great. Anyway, so I might be all over the place because, as I said, it's an impromptu video. Didn't really prepare like notes or anything, so I'm just speaking, and I have memory trouble, so All right, so first, I guess I'll state maybe a few, I guess now known facts. That the Eastern Orthodox knew scholasticism. Aquinas was translated into Greek. First Aquinas, then obviously some of the Greeks knew Latin also. so they could read stuff for themselves. It's pretty famous that Scholarius, I don't know the English pronunciation, Gennadius or Gennadius, whatever. Scholarius was a fan of Aquinas, and also he was aware of Scotus, at least of the formal distinction issue, which helped him to kind of try to make Ptolemism more, I guess it's maybe a controversial statement, but more orthodox, small o, orthodox. Because even the Byzantines realized Ptolemism sounds like some ancient heresies. So in order to make it not sound like that, they kind of try to, in their different ways, to kind of explain what Ptolemus really meant. And in explaining what he really meant, they, of course, applied some scholastic insights, particularly Scotus insights. So I guess that's common knowledge now, right? But it's also interesting that once Byzantine Empire fell completely, once the, not only Constantinople was sacked, but Greeks were basically, their state was done, right? So some people, especially the ones that stayed in Union, they moved to southern Italy, and that's those are the ancestors of our Italo Byzantine church, or Italo-Albanian church. But the immigration obviously wasn't just Albanians, it was Greeks and Albanians. Of course, as we know, most Greeks did not stay in Union. So that's why I guess some Greeks, they basically kind of mixed with Albanians, and now it's kind of like one tradition, I guess, but you do still find some Greek descent members of. And other Greeks found kind of refuge in Kievan lands. I guess not by large numbers, but there's some numbers. Like for example, in the Black Sea region, in Georgia, you still find Greeks or people of Greek descent. But some went to Moscow and Kiev to establish seminaries and theological or universities, whatever I guess you could call them. Along with that, they brought their knowledge of scholastic literature. Of course, it wasn't like a big, I guess, not library, but whatever collection of books. But for example, there's a website of the monastery of Holy Trinity that Saint Sergius of Radonezh established, and they have on their website they have the collection of the manuscripts all digitized. And if you go to the collection from the Moscow Spiritual Academy, it has Summa Theologiae, handwritten Summa Theologiae in Latin, because at that time they did study Latin and Greek equally. So Russians did have, educated Russians did have knowledge of scholastic works, and this is why Florovsky and those type of authors call this period Latin captivity. That Russians were infatuated with Western theology, and they abandoned their Eastern theology as if they're opposed. But the fact is, scholasticism is simply a development, systematization of patristic thought. And if you open manuals, Catholic manuals, they all speak of this, that they break it up into different periods. So the first is the Apostolic Period, which can be broken into like the Apologetic Period, where Melaton of Sardis and those type of authors, they would just speak about God in general, would kind of make fun of the pagan gods and that stuff, and just lay out just the charisma, like the general understanding of reality according to Christian views, right? And then you have like fathers who already had like some theology in it, like Clement of Alexandria, Hippolytus of Rome, etc. Right? That developed into Nicene theology once the Greek terminology from pagan Greek philosophy was introduced into theology, and that's where you get terms like of one essence, or similar to, similar in essence, all those terms that would use Greek words. And if we had like Orthodox traditionalists, or maybe even some Catholic traditionalists, they would say like, oh, this is innovation. We didn't have those terms. And that's actually exactly what a lot of heretics, they would say this, that where do you find of one essence in the scripture? Where do you find of one essence among the early fathers? And of course the answer would be, well, you can't find the term, but the concept is there. So the fact that we use different concepts or new concepts doesn't mean that the content of these concepts was never there. So for some reason, some people think that the patristic is like the highest level of development. But what is scholasticism really? I mean, sure, the term scholasticism, like from schools, right? Like in Paris, or the monastic schools. But essentially, it's trying to systematize whatever the fathers said. Of course, in the early scholastic period, it's mostly Western fathers. But then, if you read Aquinas, obviously, they knew John Chrysostom, they knew Basil the Great, Gregory the Great, John of Damascus, etc. And actually, I would say they had a better knowledge of kind of both worlds, East and West, than the Orthodox, because the Orthodox basically abandoned Western fathers, more or less. So you still had, like in the collections, they still have sermons of Gregory the Great, the Pope, and stuff like that, but it was very like here and there, or like dialogues, so that's why like Saint Benedict of Norcia, or whatever, he's in the Orthodox calendar. But that's just very generally. They didn't read Augustine, they didn't read Ambrose, Hilary of Poitiers, other important Western fathers. But anyway, in systematizing, they were able to work on precision of what is being said. Because if you read patristic theology, the problem with patristic theology is much like the problem with the scriptures. You read the scriptures, and one verse might have so many interpretations according to different people, because different people have different backgrounds, different preconceived notions, and so they interpret one verse differently because they see different things in it. So same way with patristics, with the fathers. I mean, you read some fathers and you find different interpretations. Like, for example, Cyril of Alexandria speaks of one nature, of God the incarnate. Sorry, I'm like translating from the terms that I know, but I don't know them in English, so I have to like translate them in my head. And there are different works. So the Monophysite party would interpret this as one nature, obviously a monophysis, hence the Monophysite. And then even among that group, that's why you have like Monophysites, Monophthalites, then you have Miaphysites, that the contemporary Oriental churches call themselves Miaphysites, not Monophysites, because they also condemn Dioscorus and those guys. But it's still like, the point is, it's still different interpretations of just one verse. And then, of course, there are the Byzantine, the Melkite widely understood, I don't mean Melkite Catholic, but Arab non-Monophysite Arabs and Syrians and those guys. So they had a different understanding, right? Because also what you have like terminology is called the Old Nicene and New Nicene theology, which differentiates between more. It puts more differentiations, right, of what nature means and hypostasis and those things, right? The Old Nicene theology didn't differentiate very clearly between those things, and so to the Monophysite or Miaphylite or Miaphysite party, it sounded like abandonment of Old Nicene theology and also introducing novel things, but really Byzantines just try to systematize it, and they realized that in different parts of one work, different fathers could mean different things by different words, even though they use the same word. It's kind of like when does the transubstantiation happens? So you open Chrysostom, in one place he says right after the words "This is my body, and this is my blood," the transubstantiation occurs, and in another words he says epiklesis, like when you call upon the Spirit to come, because you call it by name, right? So that's when it happens in one Father. So of course you have to accept the fact that maybe some fathers also had different views in different times and in different, even maybe during the day, their kind of opinion would change. They are holy, but it's not like they're constantly connected with the Spirit of God, right? So anyway, so for example, Maximus the Confessor, it's really, if you read Maximus the Confessor and then you read Athanasius, they're very different. They're so different that you can clearly see like the development, and you can even start criticizing Maximus for being bringing too much theory into theology, right? Because he speaks about a very wide array of issues. And so then we come to scholasticism, as I try to kind of get into it. But scholasticism takes all these generalizations and tries to kind of improve upon them. So what does the Father mean when he says this, and what does he mean when he says that? So that's where you have distinctions. For example, when you say God is good, what do you actually mean? Right? So you have to start introducing distinctions, right? So like, what does that mean? Or when you say God is for example, I don't exactly remember the verse, but in the Old Testament, God says, "I'm the author of good and evil." And of course, we don't mean it, we don't understand it in a dualistic sense. So then again, it's a question of like these exact things. And the way you do it is through terminology, and that's where you get like the complex, well, to us, I guess it's complex. It's not that complex. Once you learn the vocabulary, it's not that difficult. At least to read. Of course, it's difficult to grasp, but not to read. And then different authors had, made the extra steps in how detailed they want to be. Like Aquinas or Scotus. Scotus is much more complicated because he's much more precise, much more detailed in what he says. So anyway, so this is the systematization. And I guess Russians, I mentioned this in Reason and Theology, weren't really big on theoretical theology. So they had a kind of difficult time of comprehending certain theological things. And I think scholasticism helped them to make sense of what they're reading, actually. Because as much as we want to differentiate between East and West, it is Europe. It's still like European thought, right? So Russians, I guess I'm trying to say, were even more kind of, as much as they were Byzantine, right? There was as much Western influence, right, or cultural, I guess, on the way we think and stuff like that. So we do, when they say the Western Roman mind is more legalistic, and well, I think Russian mind is closer to that than in some ways than to the abstract Byzantine, like Greek way of thinking. So that's why I think a lot of Russians took well to scholasticism, and not only in theology but also in spirituality. So, for example, I have this book here. It's Iliotropion, which is by let's see if you can see it, by John Maximovich, but not of Shanghai. It's of Tobolsk. So John of Tobolsk. And he took the work of Jeremiah Drexel, at least that's how I think you pronounce it. He's a German Jesuit. And it's called On How to Harmonize Human Will with the Divine Will. And actually was originally, it says here, like, с церковно-славянского на русский. So it means from Church Slavonic to Russian. So there was a copy of a German Jesuit, essentially, in Church Slavonic. So yeah. And then you have, like, a whole work about it. And then also there is... that's just Russian, and then in Greeks, the Unseen Warfare by Nicodemus the Hagurite, which is basically Lorenzo Scopoli's work. I don't remember, Spiritual Warfare, I think it's called, or I'm mixing the two. I don't remember the names exactly. I read both, so I like them both. So yes, that's why I think scholasticism is good. And it has a connection with Russian like way of thinking, Russian theology, etc. So let me just say I'm not a big fan of the whole reassourcement going back to the fathers. It has some good, obviously, digging up new fathers that haven't been translated. Let's translate them again. Let's maybe read them closer, more attentively, without preconceived notions. Let's try to really read and listen to what they say. In that sense, I think it's good, it's fine. But basing like your theology with opposition between scholasticism and patristic thought, I think it's wrong. So as I mentioned in the beginning, I did want to call this video "I Don't Like Scholasticism," so I'll from my Eastern perspective, I'll mention some things. So Bessarion, who's just a amazing figure. I get really like inspired when I read about him, when I study him, and he's an interesting figure in that he did extensively read Aquinas. He has in his library he had a huge Aquinas collection. Obviously, the Summa. Both Summas, his works, and anything he could get his hands on. And most of his work, most of his library was, aside from Greek stuff and patristics, was covered with Thomistic works. But at the same time, he also read Scotus, so he had Scotus in his library, though not as much, because it was I guess, after second scholasticism, that's where Scotus and Scotism becomes the primary school, not Thomism. But at that time, it was still kind of both ways. I guess equally, maybe in some places, Thomism was more popular. But anyway, and he was actually a custodian of the Franciscan order, as I remember, right? So he has connection to both. But at the same time, when we read about once he goes, kind of has to, originally after the Council of Florence, he really wanted to go back to Greece and bring union to Greece and to the Greek people. But as you know, he was kind of attacked, he was kind of pushed away, and eventually Greece deserted the union under the sermons and like the activity of Mark of Ephesus and other guys. So people who want to venerate Mark of Ephesus, it really blows my mind. I mean, you want to venerate a person who brought people back to schism. And according to Catholic teaching, when you don't know better, you can't be liable. Even mortal sin, you have to commit it knowingly. If you don't, then you're not liable at least as much. But at this point, you are talking about people already knowing the truth. So after Florence, it's been declared that this is what the church teaches and what they should follow also. And now people knowingly will abandon that. That is, I mean, we can't judge a person until second coming, when we will see everything uncovered. But just formally, that person is very likely to go to hell. So you're venerating a person who sends souls to hell, essentially. I don't want to speculate on whether, he's guilty or whether he himself is in hell. I don't know that, because for all I know, he might have confessed his his schism before he died. So I can't say on that. That's why Mark of Ephesus is very different from Photius, or very different even from Palamas. So Palamas, sure, he opposed the council of Leon, right? I think of Leon. Might be wrong. I always mix up Western names. Anyway, so, but at least he wasn't part of the council. He was a part of the group that accepted it and then said, no, we made a mistake. Right, so at least it wasn't that. So that's why I do say that for Palamas, I'm more relaxed. I do try to fight his veneration as much as I can, because I do think he's not an appropriate person to venerate. But I actually don't, I'm not as harsh in my criticism of Palamas as I am with Mark of Ephesus. I think Eugenicus is an unacceptable person to venerate. Anyway, so going back to Bessarion, he had I guess it's way longer than 20 minutes, and I'm ranting, but I guess, might be interesting, I don't know. So yes, Bessarion, once he once he moved back to Italy, when he moved to Italy, he did now know Aquinas and did respect Aquinas and Scotus and those guys, but he did really focus on his background, and specifically on Dionysius the Areopagite at that time. And it's very interesting. The focus for him was on apophatic theology, and here I'll quickly mention that it's interesting how radical apophaticism was actually practiced by the least known scholastic school, which is school of Albert the Great and Albertus. I guess there are some famous names like Albert the Great himself, and then Dionysius, the Carthusian. He's pretty famous, I think. And then Meister Eckhart, Henry of Suso, the German mystics in general, and then also Nicholas of Cusa, Nicholas Cusanus, who was not exactly a scholastic if you read him, but he follows the thought and concepts that were developed by Albertus. And I'm not saying that Bessarion was an Albertist, or probably not at all, and he didn't really read him. But it's interesting that the original envoy, the group that was sent to discuss with Greeks before Council of Florence, so I guess the Council of Leon, I think, where a group was sent to discuss with the Greeks. It was Nicholas of Cusa and was Dionysius the Carthusian, who were both followers of Albert the Great. They tried to kind of establish the ground for union on apophaticism, because among all these scholastics, the focus on Dionysius and on the Neoplatonists like Porphyrius and stuff like that was among the Albertists, the school of Albert the Great. So maybe that's the kind of a little bit of connection. And also it's interesting that School of Albert was really thriving in Poland, so the closest, I guess, Catholic country to Russia. So I don't know. But anyway, so he kind of focused on his background using just all kinds of knowledge. And so my first kind of criticism to scholasticism is this trying to breaking up into groups and trying to kind of see the interests of your school above the interests of finding the truth sometimes. Not always, but sometimes. And of course, it's a complicated issue because the reason for many opinions among a certain group is the way they think about it. So one of the episodes in Reason and Theology was with the Dominican father, forget his name, who was saying like about the bridging the gap between Thomism and Paulinism, and he says, in the details, it's impossible because it's just a different way of thinking about things. You have to like redo the whole thing. So for example, he gave an opinion of why is it this need to bridge the gap between the creatures and the creator, and the way Paulinism does it. Because in Paulinistic kind of worldview cosmology, God kind of creates the world and then he's kind of not abandoned it, but he's transcendental completely to it. He kind of has no kind of, he's not touch, there's no like, not connection, but no, they're not like touching, I guess. So the energy thing is supposed to be like the bridge between the two. And the father says, Dominican father says, it's unnecessary in Thomistic theology because according to Thomism, God is constantly creating the world. He's kind of constantly upholding it, and that's kind of the mentality. And so his act, his energies is what he does in the world. So giving grace to people, upkeeping the world, all that stuff, it is already his energy, right? It's already his action. So yeah, and also, like, take Thomism, for example, they were against Immaculate Conception, but at the second scholasticism from Spain, they were able to kind of explain Thomistically why Immaculate Conception is orthodox as well. So the point is, they were able to hold their kind of worldview, general Thomistic worldview, but do correct it according to their general worldview, right? So it's not like it's impossible. So technically, I guess University of Being, for example, it's not a necessarily scotistic position. And I think Jesuits proved it. The fact that they took some Thomistic positions, some scotistic positions, some original positions like Molinism and stuff like that is neither scotistic or Thomistic, and create like a synthesis of some kind of how they see fit. And so my general criticism is number one. Sorry, my cat wants me to open the... Of course, just like usual, the cat scratches the door. I open it and the cat is not there. Anyway, so Thomism, why I don't like it, is they are kind of like know-it-all kind of people, and Thomism, to be frank, it's quite simplistic in a sense. It gives a very easy explanation to things, and it lacks a bit of details that some other schools have. So it's very... that's why Aquinas is called the common doctor, because he's the easiest to kind of comprehend, easiest to study and stuff like that. Of course, that's not to say Thomism is simplistic. I'm just saying that it's kind of it's easy to catch kind of this mentality that I know now everything because I have Thomism. I can explain everything. Thomism, sorry, I keep saying Thomism, but TH Thomas, so Thomas. That's number one. So Scotism, to me, it's a very complex. I mean, the thought of Scotus, because some Scotists try to but try to present views of Scotus in a more systematic and logical manner than Scotus did, because he's such a genius that he was really all over the place in his works, and so he wasn't able to produce like a solid, like small summa, because his thought was very vast and he was a genius like that. But obviously that poses a lot of problems in understanding Scotus, and also because of what's that thing called? Patris Aeternis, forget the name, that promulgated using Aquinas. And of course that meant that people will really focus on Aquinas, not on Scotus. And so now we don't really have enough... it's being changed now, but generally if you don't know Latin, there's no way for you in English to read Scotus unless you look for it. But yeah, he's much more complicated. I think it has like a tinge of hipsterism, in a sense that like they're not like, you know, the mainstream Thomists, so it could be a problem. Now, third school, which is pretty not famous, so people generally oppose like Thomism and Scotism, but I already mentioned it, to the school of Albert the Great. And to me, the problems are also evident in how esoteric they are, how it's difficult to find literature by students of Albert, and of Albert himself. It's really, he's not very well translated, actually, Albert the Great, even though the Great. So he's among Gregory the Great and other greats. But he's not that well translated. And also, when we read about Albertists, they were really, and it's why I like them and I don't like them at the same time, their positions, they kind of held a common view of certain things, but then they were just really different. All of them were really different, which is good and bad at the same time. So because schools are good in the fact that you get like a holistic approach to a theological world, and you are given kind of ready answers according to that school, right? So Albertist school didn't have really any of that, and also maybe we read that they were very they were controversialists. They liked to you know, get into like verbal battles, and when other schools would refer back to their masters, like the Aquinas for Thomists or Scotus for Scotus, Albertists didn't do that. They could quote Albert the Great, but they were very like free-thinking people. So they had principles down, and then the rest they could, you know. So they had a difficult time because they couldn't like say, well, didn't your master say this? They couldn't do that and Albertists were really getting into fights and liked to debate, and people didn't like to debate them because, you know, they couldn't like agree on one thing, right? So the point is that when you're a Byzantine Catholic, I'll try to wrap up. That really what you're trying to do is not get as much as I think you should study scholasticism. I think you should abandon the Latin and leave it for the Latins to do, you know, and it will help us if they do that, right? But for ourselves, we can provide a different program by studying scholastics and then reading the fathers as much as the scholastics and trying to see which positions coincide with which fathers, because it's also, people present patristics as if it's one position. There's a whole array of positions. You know, people who study patristics divide into different schools, and I'm not only saying Antiochians and the Alexandrians. There's much more complicated kind of divisions and stuff like in that regard. So to see kind of which positions you can hold, which you can't hold, and just study it. And because we're not, we live in the 21st century, A, and B, also we are lay people, simple people who won't be able to be smart enough to call ourselves one group, really. So we should just be aware of all kinds of opinions and know that they're all orthodox, right? But focus specifically on the ones that maybe generally coincide more to the Byzantine position or not. So yeah, I think that's the project for us, to be Bessarians of the future, of to know both traditions well, to breathe with both lungs, but also not treat patristic period as equal to scholasticism in a lot of ways. I think scholasticism is superior in many ways, just through development, but it doesn't mean they're opposed. I guess general Byzantine worldview, like Dionysius, the Areopagite, it's much more hierarchical. It's not like one level is opposed or worse in that regard. it means it's on a next level thing. So we should try to bridge this gap. I guess maybe in terms of like neo-scholastics, that's maybe kind of our mission, is to show the harmony between the two. And yeah, so later maybe next video I'll talk about maybe the difference between sticking to the fathers and sticking to church teaching. So we'll see. And then after maybe there are 2-3 more questions, I will do the next Q&A session. Господи Иисусе Христе, Сыне Божий, помилуй нас. Аминь.